Okay, we're still talking about Shakespeare's influence on the English language. If you have read Chaucer, you probably read the Canterbury Tales in a translation, a modern English translation of Chaucer, because original Chaucer is in fairly old Middle English, and you read it in Swan the I won't go into that because you've heard it before. But it's almost unintelligible as modern English. You can't read it without reading the translation and really get the sense of it. However, Shakespeare wrote several hundred years later, almost 300 years, 250 years later, after Chaucer. And Shakespeare had the advantage of a couple of different things. First, he was writing in London, and he was using what was becoming the most standard English of the nation of Britain at the time. And so his English was part of the formative English that became modern English. In fact, some people have said that Shakespeare is the beginning of modern English and the end of Middle English. You can read Shakespeare and understand it, even if you only understand modern English. If you understand Middle English, it makes more sense. Most of Shakespeare, though, even without Middle English background, you can read it and understand it. Partly it's because Middle English hasn't evolved that much since Shakespeare. He made such an impact on it, and the King James Bible at the same time, such an impact on English that it kind of like stabilized it for a while. In fact, I would probably say that up until maybe 50, 60 years ago, the English language stayed really pretty close to Shakespearean English, even American English. Now, the last 50 years have brought dramatic changes, partly because of the technology of computers and proliferation of other kinds of print media. But Shakespearean English dominated the way English was for a long, long time. Things changed, these and thous dropped out, whatnot, but still Shakespearean English was the biggest. Shakespeare was the biggest influence on English for a very long time. Why is that? Why did people still have always looked back at Shakespeare and said, this guy was amazing? There's a lot of different things. First, he makes amazing characters. He has some of the most memorable characters in all of literature. Hamlet, great character. Romeo and Juliet, great characters. He does a great characterization of other people who are already famous, like Julius Caesar or Brutus. The characters he evokes are not only vivid, but they're very real. And you get a very strong sense as you listen to them or watch them that that's a real person. That Shakespeare has done more than create like sort of a cardboard character of a person. He's got a real person behind the words in mind, and he's speaking the words of a real person. And so his characters are incredibly vivid. That's one of the things. He also does a great job with plot. Plot twists and surprises, little hints and foreshadowings that set things up and then later come to play. We see that in Macbeth with the witches. They start with the witches and they all make prophecies. And, hey, what happens? The prophecies come true. But it sets the stage for the whole play. Shakespeare does a great job with plot twists and things like that. He also has all sorts of depth in the plays. He's examining very difficult topics. In Macbeth, for example, he's examining the topics of kingship and what makes a good king and a bad king, murder, the rights of kings over their subjects, the lust for power, both in men and women, because Lady Macbeth is an important part of this story. And he's also examining madness and what makes people crazy. And he does a great job of it. And people look back and they go, wow, he really examines that well, almost as if he's a psychologist. It's part of the magic of Shakespeare that his characters have so much depth. Now, it's not true in every play. If you read his comedies, they're just shallower characters, and they're funny, but the characters don't have the kind of depth you find in Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, some of the Henry plays. He writes with a lot of depth. That's one of the reasons people still study him. Another reason people study him is just because you watch the whole play, any of his plays, almost any of them, and you walk away going, that was head and shoulders better than any other play I've ever seen. It's subjective, right? There's people who argue that so-and-so writes better plays, or this play's better than that, or it's all subjective. But in general, in 400 years, no one's done better than he has, certainly as far as plays go, and just in terms of storytelling. He's an amazing storyteller. Right, this guy. 400 years, and we still haven't topped it. That's why we study him. And one of the things that makes him the most impressive, at least in my mind, and one of the things that most impresses me, is how well he uses words. At the beginning of the 16th century, that's the 1500s, English as a language wasn't that well developed. It was coming together, and English has always been a polyglot, a big collection of a bunch of different languages. It has to do with French, there's Latin elements, there's all sorts of Norman and Norse, Viking elements, and there's Celtic and Welsh, all these things that have come together to make modern English. It's much more of a grouping of different things. And so in the 1400s and into the 1500s, English was not that clearly defined. There's variants of it in different places. And supposedly, at the beginning of the 1500s, even the English weren't that impressed with their own language. In fact, most scholarship was done in Latin or French, those two things. Books that were written, even in those days, about, like the Morte d'Arthur, was written in French. Those things were because French was considered to be a more scholarly language, and Latin was the most scholarly language. And English was just kind of like, street language. That's what you used when you're buying something from the butcher. Hey! Get me a couple sides of beef there, thanks. I don't know why I'm using an Australian accent when I do that. That's just the first one that came to mind. English was not that well regarded as a language. But by the end of the 1500s, into the beginning of the 1600s, it started to have its own sort of art form to it, and people began to see English as a legitimate and powerful language. And Shakespeare took that to the next level. He took the English language and did beautiful things with it. He invented all sorts of words, all sorts of phrases. One of the things he did very well was puns. He took things that mean one thing, and the clear meaning is real obvious, but there's a second meaning that makes what he says funny. And we'll look at those as we go through, specifically through each play. There's all sorts of puns that he uses, and he used them well. I read a little statistic that I thought was pretty interesting. The King James Bible, written in 1611, so again, about the same time, uses 8,000 different English words. 8,000. The same statistic that I saw quoted says the average educated person today, nowadays, uses about 15,000 words, 15,000 distinct words. Now, we may know more words than that, but we don't use them all, right? So you don't use the word anti-disestablishmentarianism all that regularly, even if you do know what the word means. But in the Shakespearean plays, he uses 30,000 different distinct English words. 8,000 for the King James Bible, 15,000 for your average educated person, 2,000 or 3,000 for your average McDonald's employee, and 30,000 for Shakespeare. He created words that no one had ever used before. He put words together. He added prefixes and suffixes to words that no one had done before. And the audience was like, whoa, hey, that's a new word. And they loved it. And people still love it. And you still read these plays and you go, oh, that's a really creative use of the language. He was gifted at taking words and putting them in unique ways. And he also had, I don't know if it was a difficulty or maybe it might have even been an advantage, that he was writing in poetic verse. Iambic pentameter is what it's known as. Shakespearean pentameter also it's called sometimes. It's that each verse of the play, when you look at it in the book you'll see this, it's a certain number of syllables long. Pentameter, that's penta, 5. 5 couplets, so essentially 10 syllables. 5 pairs of syllables, goes this way, doesn't it? 5 pairs of syllables in each line. And iambic means that it alternates in terms of its rhythm. Ba, 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 which is the natural rhythm of English. So he's working in a verse pattern that does mimic natural English. But the reason that they did this in plays was it was easier for the actors to remember their lines. If the lines had a certain rhythm to them, and there was some rhyming to it, but certainly the rhythm and the pattern of it made it easier to memorize the lines for the actors. And that tradition was there before Shakespeare, but he did take it to the next level. Now, is that an advantage, iambic pentameter, or is it a disadvantage? Well, it makes it hard to write because you've got to use that meter. You've got to sort of stay in it. But it also sort of forces you to be creative with your words, word choices. So there's times when he shortens words or adds things just to make them fit the iambic pentameter rhythm. And thus he was able to be creative with them and still fit in and make things that the actors could talk through. So he does a good job of creating this realistic sounding but memorable English that the actors can use. And one of the things that people have credited Shakespeare with is by doing all this, he begins to create English as a sort of coherent and cemented language. It begins to stay in place and hold itself together. That and again the King James Bible. Those things kind of they came together at the same time, and people said, well, this is what English should sound like. Also happened that this and King James came together at the time when printing presses were available. Before that, it was almost all handwritten, and once printed, now, obviously this is a more modern version, but things, once they began to be printed, they could be disseminated, they would be copied more clearly and more accurately, more rapidly, so there were more copies of them out there. And Shakespeare and the King James Bible happened to happen right at the beginning of printed literature, where suddenly everybody can get a hold of printed material. Not everybody, but a lot of people could get a hold of printed material. And so in a way, it sets this sort of bedrock foundation for the English language that it holds to for a long, long time. Other reasons we study Shakespeare is just the beauty of the words. If you read them, some of them, there's just beautiful phrases in there, and there's amazing things that he says, and deep studies of people's character. And when you read them, you go, wow, you actually can learn something from this. Now, some people have said that Shakespeare's plays, they aren't meant as a message, that there's not a point to them. I'm not sure I agree with that. Most of them seem to be about some topic or other. Often the difficulties of being a ruler, or the perils of pride, or misunderstandings between people. They're usually not a point to them other than to entertain, but there's often points within them that you can learn. And we're going to look at Macbeth and what can we learn from Macbeth. There's a lot of topics that Shakespeare covers. He extensively covers the topics of monarchy, of tragic heroes who are put into difficult situations, like Hamlet, or Romeo and Juliet. He explores the nature of love in several of his plays. He also explores just comedy and what makes people laugh, what is funny to people. And he explores spirituality. An interesting question to ask about Shakespeare is, what is Shakespeare's worldview? Does Shakespeare have a Christian worldview? To some degree, probably everybody who was alive in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, that time range, had something of a Christian worldview, because the church was pretty pervasive in England in those days. He grew up probably going to church and probably pretty aware of the Bible. There's some argumentation that he quotes the Bible in places, not directly quoting it, but just referring to it and using its terminology. I'd have to look more at that to decide whether I agree with it or not, but there's people who will argue that he was very familiar with the Bible. But then you ask the question, if you look at the plays, what's his worldview? His worldview is very varied as far as the plays go, because you see the plays through the eyes of the characters, and he does an amazing job of putting you in these characters who were, in a sense, sometimes not Christians. So Macbeth, if you look at King Macbeth himself, is the guy a Christian? He's part of a marginally Christian country. Now, you can make the argument about Scotland in the thousands, the 11th century. It had been exposed to Christianity, but it wasn't a fully Christian country at the time. So you can make the argument either way about Macbeth. But we see the storyline develop essentially through Macbeth's eyes. So is Shakespeare saying anything on his own about his worldview through Macbeth, or has he so transported himself into Macbeth that we're only seeing the world through Macbeth's eyes? It's a legitimate question. So you got to ask that question about him. What is his worldview? In Macbeth, we start the play with witches. Witches boiling up some sort of cauldron of some sort of spell, and then they cast forward a prophecy about both Macbeth and Banquo and Banquo's descendants that comes true. Now, I'll come back to this, but that's from a historical record of something that supposedly did happen to the real King Macbeth. Also, we see those same witches come back when Macbeth summons them, and we see ghosts. We see prophecies, we see ghosts, we see madness. You're left with the question as an audience member and a reader, do those things really happen, or are they just things that Macbeth envisions as he descends into madness? Are they things that the playwright has put there, Shakespeare has put there, as literary figures, essentially, literary imaginings that are supposed to tell us something about the play and set the stage, or are they really part of the worldview of the author? I don't know. I'm not the author. But you can say that probably back in the 1500s, 1600s, that people believed that witches were real. and that people could do sorcery and divine the future, that even with the Christian worldview, those things were part of the view that of reality. People thought those things really happened. So Shakespeare opens the play of Macbeth, set in the 1500s. It starts in a stormy night, and there are 3 witches that we find on stage, and that's where the play begins. What does that tell us about Shakespeare's worldview? I don't know. It might tell us that he believed in witches. It might be just a literary device that he's using. Makes part of the mystery. Part of the mystery of Shakespeare is that you really just don't see the author and what he thinks in the plays as clearly as you do in some other writings. You don't get the literary or editorial comments from the author in his plays that you do get in a lot of written literature. He gets you so immersed into the characters, and he gets so immersed into the characters, that what you see is the worldview of the characters. So was Shakespeare a Christian? Does he write from a Christian worldview? It's a really hard question to answer. Exposed to the Bible? Yes, probably. Raised in the church? Yes, probably. But what do we see of it in the plays? You could go either way in describing the worldview of the plays in terms of whether they believe in the Bible and whether or not the plays have a Christian worldview. It's an interesting question.